Good morning, everybody. My name is Drew Armstrong. I'm the host of Post Talk Live. I'm also the executive editor over here at Endpoints News. Great to see you all and be with you all. It is Friday, April 24th, and today we are going to be talking about the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's MAHA era, vaccine and public health policy in the U.S., and maybe what comes next. Now, senior reporter Max Bayer and I are doing the show together today. We're going to get right into things. And I think, getting ready for this show brought me right back to a very interesting period of my life journalistically and personally. But Max, I want to ask you, what were you doing during the pandemic? What was your pandemic?
Oh, my pandemic was nuts. I was doing a lot of data work at CBS News, covering daily infection trends, hospitalizations, deaths, working a lot with different producers and correspondents to sort of track that data. It ebbed and flowed. It started with sort of making sure we were getting the most accurate data out of China and then counting cases by county. And then, I'm sure you're aware, there was the Johns Hopkins project. There was the COVID tracking project. It was an immersion and a thrown into the deep end pool of data journalism that I felt ill-equipped for, but ultimately, tried to.
Were you an in the office guy, or were you buckled down at home in an apartment in Brooklyn or something like that?
Very buckled down in an apartment.
Okay.
And we were about to hear from the person who sort of sent us home once the pandemic took over, and we left CBS. And then it was work from home from then on for the next 2 years, effectively.
We'll get into our guest in a moment and her connection to Max, but my experience was much the same as you, Max. I remember my wife, my 3-year-old and our 6-month-old did a 15-hour straight shot drive from New York to Atlanta overnight. We peed in parking lots and ate sandwiches out of cooler to get down to my wife's parents' house. And I was at Bloomberg at the time, and I was running the Bloomberg vaccine tracking project, and that's where we did our lockdown. But it was a very strange experience between, I think, being very stuck at home and then occasionally going out into the field to hospitals and seeing all sorts of crazy stuff from the impacts of COVID. And so, well, we're going to talk about the fallout from that. And as it happens, as Max was referencing, our guest today is Max's former boss at CBS News, Brinda Adhikari. Brinda is the host of podcast Why Should I Trust You, which talks about public health, trust, and she and her co-hosts talk regularly about the post-pandemic era, what it's meant for our country's conversation about vaccines and public health, the rise of MAHA, and how our government and citizenry relate to each other. Quick housekeeping note before we get started. If you are joining us for the first time, hello, and thank you for being here. Post Talk Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom live to you. If you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, please hit that little subscribe button down in our feed. You'll get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post Talk email on your endpoints.news subscription page. For those of you on YouTube, there's also a little chat. You can ask us questions. We'll try to get to them. Our producers in the background will feed them to us. So, Brinda, welcome to the show. It is great for you to be here with us. Will you tell us, you were at CBS, you run a podcast now. Why'd you make the switch, and what did you want to talk about? Tell us about the show and why we're talking to you.
Well, thank you so much, Drew and Max, for welcoming me onto Endpoint News. I just want to say, being introduced as the person who sent Max home and Max's boss is does anyone do you like me? Come on. I didn't send you home. It was a pandemic.
Well, to be clear, I didn't mean it was a lambasting. I meant it was to be clear to our viewers, Brinda sent everybody home for public health reasons.
I only sent Max home.
She was doing a corporate. This was a corporate decision that was made. It wasn't.
No. It was so crazy, Max. I'm totally just giving you. Can we curse on this shit? I don't know. Anyway, I just did.
Just love it.
Okay, let me focus on what you just asked, Drew. So, I've been in media for almost 25 years. I was at ABC News and CBS News for almost 20 years. I had the privilege of being Jon Stewart's executive producer on a show on Apple called The Problem with Jon Stewart. And my whole life, I've really been interested in reporting and storytelling and journalism. And honestly, I'd say after the pandemic, after the show on Apple, I had this moment where I had decided that I wasn't sure that the corporate media structure was really one where I think I could like tell the kinds of stories that I was really interested in doing. And then secondly, I'd say, guys, like after 2024, and I wonder if you felt this as well, I was like, we can't do this the same way anymore. Like we can't just keep talking inside of our silos and keep doing it in a way where we just make content for people who are values aligned with us. And so I made the decision with a friend of mine, Tom Johnson, and at the same time, this virologist, Maggie Bartlett, who's a co-host on the podcast from Hopkins, she had reached out being like, look, public health is in crisis. People aren't trusting it. I found that to be a really interesting kind of like a framework.
Yeah.
And long story short, we decided to launch a podcast that could be kind of this live space at the same time that Trump and Kennedy were going to be governing. And yeah, so that's why we started it.
You guys have, I mean, you guys have had a lot of people from the administration on or adjacent to the administration. Was that a purposeful choice around, hey, we need to have newsmakers on, or was it more like we need to talk to the people who are in power or who reacted against a lot of the things that happened to the pandemic and try to bridge this conversation?
I'd say when we first started, the very first goal was to really speak with people who are kind of regular people. And by that, I mean, they don't necessarily hold like a position of power in government. They're not necessarily deeply influential in a media way. So our very first episode was actually with a mother who had voted Democrat her whole life and then decided to vote for Trump because of her affinity for Kennedy. And it turned out, you know, she was a MAHA supporter and a Kennedy volunteer for the campaign. And then slowly, you know, as we then started moderating these conversations between supporters of MAHA and public health, veterans, it just became clear that you could really kind of like hit a broad spectrum of people. And yeah, I'd say as the show grew, you know, it became clear that we had an opportunity to bring people in who either folks in public health weren't accessing because of the polarization.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you know, we've had Jay Bhattacharya on, we've had the former head of ASIP on. There's a few others coming up, which hopefully it'll all pan out. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, and we've also had big names from you know, the medical freedom movement and MAHA. So we really aim for it to be kind of this weird space where lots of people feel free to speak.
Yeah.
What's your takeaway from, I mean, you know, we'll get into this in a lot of detail, but like, is there one big learning that you have had from having a lot of different types of voices on in a, you know, kind of more expansive long form format where you can really talk about this stuff?
For sure. I'd say the main thing is that our views are much more on a spectrum than they are on poles, on different polarities. When you are looking at something on Twitter, when you are looking at a representative of something that, you know, may have a very strong view and maybe for years has expressed that view, or you have folks who are trying to kind of make money off of a view, they are, I'm not trying to undermine the impact and their influence, but
Yeah.
most of us live on a spectrum. And that has been a real gift to bring the temperature down and to really relate with people who, I mostly don't talk to people who are fully anti-vaccine. They, I think that was a big learning for me on the show and continues to be, that there are so many people out there who vaccinate their children, but maybe have modified the schedule, or vaccinate their kids, but don't like all the vaccines, or vaccinate their kids, but and probably will continue to recommend vaccines, but have a lot of questions about them. And so often in the internet world we live in, we really just view ourselves as pro-vax or anti-vax, compliant or refusal. When the truth is, there's a huge in between that I don't think the media is really getting at in the way they take on this current moment we're in.
This brings us to the CDC director, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Brinda, but from my vantage point, at least with respect to vaccines and medical freedom, which I think has been sort of a core pillar of MAHA and of Kennedy, has been a tremendous bellwether of the sway of RFK within the administration, what he can and cannot get done or get agreement with the White House on. And so it brings us to the nomination of Erica Schwartz, which obviously follows this sort of gap in leadership. She's a deputy surgeon general, having served under Jerome Adams in the first Trump administration. She was immediately lauded by public health folks as sort of almost a savior, like, thank God, we have this person finally. And there were folks within sort of the vaccine skeptical realm, Aaron Siri specifically, who brought up concerns. What was your initial gut reaction to her nomination, and just where you sort of put the CDC on that continuum of MAHA's sway, at least with respect to vaccines within the Trump White House?
I think that it's more reflective of where this administration is at right now vis-a-vis Health and Human Services. I mean, it is clear, poll after poll has shown that Americans very broadly support vaccines. And even if you go a little bit more granular, they support the MMR, they support school mandates. And so, there was that famous, the Republican strategist poll that came out that,
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about whether or not, like, how much influence that had, but at the end of the day, when, for political reasons, we are finding ourselves in a moment where the attention is moving away from questioning vaccines and more towards, let's just not talk about vaccines too much, and kind of bring some calm back to people's concerns. I'd say more broadly though, Max, this doesn't feel to me like necessarily just a conversation about, or just an opportunity to talk about vaccines when it relates to somebody like Erica Schwartz, but a desire to bring just a level of calm back to the CDC at a time when it's been kind of ripped apart so much so as to not necessarily be generating trust in the public that it can just perform basic functions. So I think that on its most basic level, there is a desire amongst the public, and even, I mean, let's be honest, the public's not really thinking about the CDC a lot every day, but I think amongst public health or just in general, that, like, if there's a disease outbreak, we have, EIS officers to go in, tell us what the data is, that we're able to sort of get to a place where we're just doing, again, basic functionality. So while it definitely is somewhat of a like a referendum on whether or not the vaccine messaging is working, I think the bigger thing that is happening right now is somewhat of a acknowledgement that this agency that, let's be honest, lost a lot of trust during the pandemic, is really a shell of its former self, and it's unclear how, if at all, it's functioning.
Well,
And that there needs to be some level of, just getting it like jump starting the cables on the CDC right now.
you bring up this like real, I think a really, there's a couple of interesting nuances that you bring up, Brendan. I want to get Max's take on this too, because he, follows a lot of MAHA world pretty closely, which is this shift from let's talk about let's talk about, vaccine skepticism and raise vaccine skepticism to not like let's be pro-vaccine, but let's stop talking about vaccines. Like let's stop having whatever crazy thing the CDC was doing be an issue in a story in and of itself, and just like remove this issue a little bit politically. Max, when you saw the nomination named, like what was the reaction in MAHA world to this? Because they are a pretty potent political force right now. Like they've been, they were big voters and a big part of the coalition. Like what was the MAHA world reaction to the CDC pick?
In its immediacy, I think people were like taking a beat. I think like you had some people who were not sort of ready to immediately like cast dispersions. And there were some who were, like I mentioned Aaron Siri, but Aaron Siri is,
Yeah.
you know, an attack dog. He's a firebrand for better or for worse. And I think like he knows and values that role in a way. Like he works on behalf of the vaccine injured. He frequently is sort of someone who testifies. So I think he has a particular role. I think everyone usually seems to sort of wait until RFK says something. And there were obviously these budget hearings that were coming up. And yeah, I think also, and this is what we've reported on, people have largely been the parts of MAHA that are focused on vaccines. And I think this is where Brinda is super valuable because she knows and recognizes that there are cohorts of MAHA, people who have different value systems within the group. But speaking about vaccines, like people have been disappointed in the last year. And it sort of began with the slow, albeit sort of more truncated label, but like the continued approval of the mRNA vaccines and the lack of the mRNA vaccines being pulled. So, to some degree, maybe the nomination of Erica Schwartz was sort of like a cherry on top of decisions around vaccines that were unsatisfactory. And yeah, I didn't immediately see though this groundswell immediately of like, how could this be? And also just at like a basic level, I don't think people like knew who she was, right? Like to Brenda's point about people aren't talking about the CDC all the time. No one's talking about Erica Schwartz all the time. It's not like she was some immediate name. Like I didn't know who she was when I was reporting on her. I had to do a little bit of research.
She's not tweeting out there all the time, like it's seemingly every other major appointee.
Yeah, Brinda, was that your sense? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are one thing I've learned this year is that it's hard to talk about the MAHA movement as like a thing that is kind of like official and real.
Yeah.
What it really is in some ways is sort of an idea, and at its core, it's a loose network of grassroots kind of coalitions that have been mashed together because of Kennedy's alignment with Trump. And in a way, the CDC announcement, you're going to hear from like the Mary Talley Bowdens and the Mary Hollands and the Aaron Series and the Del Bigtrees. Like you're going to hear from the sort of CHD core that's been around for over a decade. But when it comes to MAHA, like one thing I've learned is, I mean, I'm on a bunch of chat groups with them and no one really said anything about this nomination. And a big part of it is the vaccine issue, while it animates a very loud part of the group and a real part of the group, and it animated Kennedy for a huge part of his career, it is really not the issue that animates the whole group. Yeah. And I want to make that really clear. And that's not even like, me learning that. That is something I'm hearing just over and over and over again. And while there are some real it's like socially, in terms of social media, a very salient topic. And there are, again, very loud observers inside MAHA and loud advocates who want, vaccines to be given attention. I think the one thing that's interesting right now, and the fact that it's aligned with MAGA and MAGA wants to win elections and they view vaccines as not being politically salient, it's like, because there's a desire to see Bobby Kennedy succeed, there's this sort of like, all right, well, we're gonna line up around our guy. And if the marching orders now are like, don't be loud about vaccines, okay. It's a bit of a it's like an interesting moment right now. And I'd say the issue that my sources in MAHA are singularly focused on right now is the Bayer Monsanto trial that is happening next week, the SCOTUS case that's being heard. And so the vaccine thing is again, it's like you're seeing flashes of it. It's unclear. I'm not even putting too much stake into the fact that Kennedy tried to rewrite the ACIP charter. Like I would just be shocked, and again, don't quote me on this, if you're really going to see that many more things happening. I sort of disagree with some of the takes that some folks in public health have had recently of like, no vaccines is still going to rear its ugly head in terms of how MAHA is going to respond. I kind of don't agree with that. I don't think you're going to hear much about it.
Well, that's a really interesting point because I mean they have, I think, online the vax stuff gets so much attention, but I do feel like in the real world when I talk to people who are like, people in my social circle or professional contacts who are, MAHA adjacent or MAHA curious, it really like it's so much about food. It's so much about environmental stuff. I mean, that's kind of the thing that I actually feel like I interact with more in the real world. And I don't know if that's reflective of, my personal circle or something else, but like very rarely is it a conversation about vaccine stuff.
And I'd even say, like, if you hop on these MAHA action calls, which are maybe like the ease, I would sort of argue, or like if you had like one thing to do and you wanted a snapshot of sort of the MAHA coalition as it exists, you hop on one of these Zoom calls. And like Kyle Diamantis from FDA Foods was on this week, and like Oz has been on a dozen plus times. Gary Brecka is on, and like these are folks who represent different parts, right? So like you're on a MAHA coalition call and like it's like they're talking about Medicare or Medicaid fraud, and like granted that's sort of like a political talking point right now, but like it does exemplify. And there have been times, obviously, like Robert Malone's on, they're talking about mRNA and they're talking about vaccines. So to Brinda's point, like it occupies a space, but it certainly ebbs and flows of what is the priority and what is, the coalitions, what is sort of, like a wave sort of like moving people around. Brinda, I wanted to sort of ask, you made this point, and I just to bring it back to Erica Schwartz for a second, of lost trust. And I think the reason why should I trust you has been so successful, at least in my eyes, is that you bridge trust and you listen. And so I wonder, what can the CDC do in its immediacy, obviously assuming Erica Schwartz is appointed, to work on that? Like, what are some of the discussions they need to have and with who?
Yeah, it's a great question, Max. I mean, look, to one degree, the mission of the CDC and why it exists, is something that I think still puzzles a lot of people in this country, who are like, I think they want to engage in a conversation about what the CDC is and how it can serve them in their community. Um, and, it's not to say, like, I think most people want federal agencies to provide value in their lives, but COVID really muddled for a lot of people how the CDC was showing up for them, which I think is also just it's such a difficult thing for a lot of public health people to discuss, because for them, the CDC was a vital tool during that era. And as you see outbreaks right now for measles and everything, you're seeing that, like, why we need a CDC.
Yeah.
But the truth is, having a CDC that reflects where the country's priorities are when it comes to health, and not just infectious disease, and I said this, Tom Frieden came on the show and with Mandy Cohen, and we had this like CDC director Palooza conversation. And one of the things I said, I was like, in our conversations, it sometimes feels like the only thing public health cares about is infectious disease. And that, like, the ID is like king in public health. When the truth is, the health issues that are the most salient for the American people are cost and food, water, and air safety. In fact, while what's often missing from the conversation about the popularity of vaccines is that people don't actually think about vaccines very much. It's not actually the issue that drives them when they're thinking about their health. And so there sometimes is a mismatch in what is said publicly and the attention we put to certain issues. Now, someone might say, well, what do you expect us to do when they're dismantling things and whatever? I get it. I absolutely get it. But it kind of feels like this is always the case, that public health has, vaccines have been the underpinning of public health. People talk about it from back in the Edward Jenner days, right? But public health has got to be a lot more than that. And it's got to show up in a way that I think shows people that it's there for it all. And what is happening now is people are going to kind of go to where the heat is. And if they're seeing that there's a movement out there that is surfacing those other issues that they care about, I mean, it's no wonder that they're going to be interested in that. That the polls that show that while people can't really define what the MAHA movement is, or they think it's like the MAGA movement, the actual core platforms, aside from vaccines, the core issues are very popular.
Yeah.
So just going back to the thing about the CDC, which is that there's so many things that the CDC does that I didn't even know when it comes to obesity and chronic disease and all that stuff. And there's a real hunger to engage on that level too. And I think there's a real opportunity there.
What have you gleaned in your conversations with Kirk Milheim? You've had 2 now, I believe, on the podcast. I find him to be such an interesting figure in MAHA, at the CDC, as a chairman of ACIP, or I guess former chairman of ACIP, I guess. I don't know what you would call him now. What did you learn from those conversations? Obviously, those do have a vaccine focus, but also one of the things that I appreciate about Kirk, and I thought that this really came through in the first conversation, is like his genuine focus and life's dedication to children's health. As a cardiologist, he volunteers his time abroad. Was there anything that you sort of like stunned you in that conversation, or something you really took away from those conversations?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously that first interview made some news, and what he said about the polio vaccine and things like that. But I would say, it was a long conversation, and I am always so grateful and amazed at anybody who comes on our show and speaks and feels comfortable speaking honestly about their real thoughts about things. And even if I don't agree with them, or we don't agree, or we sometimes think that they're wildly maybe unfactual or whatever, I'm really, to me, I don't think about platforming, not platforming. I'm sort of like, let's talk, let's engage. You have a position of influence in this country. I want to hear how you think. So points to him for doing that. Like you said, Max, he's a pediatric cardiologist. He travels around the world. He treats kids, and I think he's very devoted to that. I don't actually believe that he's not. I also don't know that he's anti-vaccine. I think that was actually mischaracterized in some of the media. But I do think that he, and I find this in certain individuals right now in this moment, to sort of twist themselves into a pretzel to make a point that can sometimes be the exact opposite of maybe how they actually think as a doctor. He came on our show again later to say, I'm not against the polio vaccine, but then he went on to say, but I do think there needs to be a real conversation about whether or not this moment, and I'm sort of like, okay, I don't know that you need to kind of, like, if you support the polio vaccine, say you support the polio vaccine, say it clearly, say it loudly. You can still, but at the same time, I do think that it's very difficult to have these conversations at a moment where, because we're so polarized and everyone's looking for that sort of aha gotcha moment from somebody. I think it can be really tough for folks to want to go and talk because they think they're going to be quickly boxed into something. For that, I think it was kind of a legitimate scrutiny that he faced as the head of ACIP. But I also think it's really shitty that he was like sent death threats and people were attacking him. Like, that's the part that I can never really understand. Like, why can't we engage in conversations with people we disagree with, even vehemently? What's like that always puzzles me.
We're nearing the end here, and I just sort of want to go big, and use that as a jumping off point. Why should I trust you? And your podcast work have been such a great North Star of how to engage, what to talk about, and what are the topics to discuss. So with that said, with a potential CDC director on the horizon as sort of a news peg in our world to maybe lead with, what are the discussions you want to have? What have you not sort of answered for yourself or your viewers that you think sort of directs where MAHA is headed next as both a political force, but also a general advocacy coalition?
Oh boy. I mean, I'll just say, there are so many topics in this country that the population is really curious about, but afraid to ask because they're nervous about being dismissed as being a victim of misinformation or anti-vax, or there is so much curiosity about not mainstream medicine and supplements and holistic medicine and psychedelics. There's so much. And again, I think for the public health side, there's such an opportunity there to discuss those things in good faith with facts. And I worry that sometimes they immediately get into a place of like dismissing that as like supplement pushing grifters. And I guess what I would say is, you know, don't give up your power in conversations by dismissing people.
Mm.
That there's a real opportunity for expertise and science to play a role in people's questions right now about all kinds of things. You don't just have to be a person that's there to sort of fact check people, but you're actually there to listen and find out what people are curious about, see where science supports it, see where science doesn't, see where we don't know, honestly. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I'll just say, as far as MAHA, regardless of what MAHA's called, whether it's called MAHA, whether Kennedy stays, whether he goes, whatever happens, there is no doubt that there is a movement in this country of people who are deeply frustrated by institutional medicine, that are deeply frustrated by the cost of medicine, and that have felt dismissed by expertise. And there is an opportunity, whether it's MAHA or not, to really engage this crowd. And whoever does it well will build trust in this country. That is my assessment.
I think, well, I mean, I think that's a great point for us to both end on and think about for future shows and conversations, and to encourage people to go and check out Why Should I Trust You if they haven't already. Brinda Adhikari, one of the co-hosts there, thank you so much for being with us. We are out of time, sadly, but I hope you'll join us again today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. We're going to be following these topics closely, obviously MAHA and vaccines and all of the fallout around that, a major topic for us. You can keep up with our coverage on endpoints.news and by subscribing to our newsletters. If you're in New York, you can also join us at the Financial Times' U.S. Pharma Summit on May 14, where Max is going to be leading another conversation about public health trust. The recording of today's show is on YouTube. You can also get the audio on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you're already signed up for our Post Talk newsletter, you'll get notifications next time we have a broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, go over to Endpoints News, cut right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link, and then preferences, and click to activate Post Talk. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. Huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. I am Drew Armstrong for Post Talk Live, and we will see you the next time news breaks.